welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Alex Venguer, and if you're not familiar with him, he's an engineer who has worked in a variety of genres, everything from rock, jazz, classical, hip-hop, Broadway, film scores, and a whole bunch more. He's worked with artists like Sting, Aretha Franklin, Lady Gaga, Yo-Yo Ma, and a whole bunch more as well. And if you ever listen to any of Alex's mixes, you'll notice that he tends to work on very organic sounding mixes. And when I talk about organic mixes, I'm talking about mixes that don't sound like they've been overhyped with EQ or samples or tons of layering, all that kind of stuff. It sounds like musicians playing in a room and like the tracks haven't been edited beyond that very much. Instead, everything sounds really natural and organic. So in this episode, we talk about how he goes about making recordings and mixes that have that organic sound and how to get those sounds to work well with each other. Because as you'll hear in this interview, it all starts at the recording stage. You have to get the source tones right so that everything falls into place in the mix. So we get into that in this conversation as well. Another great thing that we talk about in this interview is how to make the most out of a small mixing space, how to optimize your room, even for free. And Alex lives in New York where, let's face it, studios and living spaces are pretty small. And he primarily works out of a bedroom in his studio, but he's been able to make it work as a result of making some small tweaks around his room that can make a big improvement. And all of those tweaks that he talks about are things that you could easily do in your own home studio environment as well. So I love that we get into what those little changes were that made a big difference in Alex's room and how you can do it as well on a budget. Another big thing that we talk about in this interview is Alex's approach to the frequency spectrum in a mix. And he talks a lot about the idea of focusing on frequency spectrum as a whole, as opposed to focusing on the individual elements of a mix. And I think that that's a really important conversation to have as well, because a lot of people, we talk about like mixing in the context of the mix, but what does that really mean? Like, what are you actually listening for? Are you listening to the relationship between the kick and the bass? Or are we listening for things like the low end versus the mid-range or the top end and that kind of stuff? And Alex shares a lot of great advice on how he goes about approaching that kind of stuff in his own mixes. So there is so much good stuff in this episode. I think you're going to really enjoy it. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Alex Venguer, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me over. Thrilled to be here.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you and your background and who you are, what you do, can you give us that story on ultimately how you got into music production and what you're working on these days?
Yeah, of course. Typical rock kid, started playing guitar around, 13 years old, got into a band in high school, started getting obsessed with records and how they sounded. And, we went in our last year of high school and did a record that we paid for ourselves in a studio. This is back in Mexico City where I grew up. And it was a mariachi studio that had never done a rock record. And our rock record was basically copying a bunch of Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Beatles, and Dave Matthews and Blind Melon, and kind of mesh all that up. That was kind of the vibe. And so I started coming up with all these sort of like production ideas of like, oh, now I'm going to overdub a guitar here that does this and add this. And like, oh, Smashing Pumpkins do some harmonics in this part. I'm going to copy that and like do some. So I really got into the whole process of like just recording and had a really great time with it. So figured that was something I wanted to do. And my original intention was to focus more on the production side of things. I never figured engineering was going to be as interesting as I discovered it was. And so I went to Berkeley, started in the production and arranging majors. And with some time, I realized on the one side that I was a better engineer than producer at that point by far. It just was more natural to me. And also that I didn't love a lot of the arranging stuff because it was just like very, kind of like Disney oriented, theater oriented, that kind of stuff. And by that point, I was starting to get into classical music. So I switched that major to classical composition. And about halfway through that, while I was doing the engineering, and at that point, I was, spending every night at the studio at Berkeley doing practice time. I realized I was, again, a better engineer than composer. And also it was impossible to write a 3-part fugue when I was coming back from the studio at 5 a.m. and had to deliver at 8 a.m. So I eventually dropped composition, took a couple extra classes, which I love it, and really just delved into the engineering thing. Then moved to New York after Berkeley and started working at a studio called Sound on Sound when they were back in 45th Street, the original play location. I was a GA there for 2 years and a half, which means, running around, cleaning everything, going for food, going for runs for tapes. If some artist like this candle in this corner of Manhattan, run to there and buy the specific, smell that they like. And then that started shifting into assisting. There was a long period where I was doing both general assisting and assisting and actually doing sessions. And then eventually after 2 years and a half, moved up to assistant. And around then, Sound and Sound merged with another big studio in New York called Right Track, and it became Legacy Studios at that point, which eventually became MSR. And so I got to, be an assistant basically there. That was my assisting years for, again, 2 years and a half. And then I just jumped out and went freelance, and it's been well over 10 years, 15 years. Hard to keep track at this point. But just, first week out of being an assistant, I was like, oh no, what do I do? And now I have no work. And, a month went by with like one session. I was, freaking out. And then little by little stuff started coming out. And, years later, I'm just like still hoping you get the calls and luckily getting them for the most part. So that's,
of course.
The overall story, the arc.
Yeah. That's cool. Well, there was a couple things that you said there that I'd love to dial back or go back to. And the first being that you talked about your early experience being in the studio with your band. And one of the things you mentioned was like that idea of, listening to other songs and saying like, oh, Pink Floyd does this or Zeppelin does this or whatever. And you then wanting to incorporate those layers and elements into your productions. And I think that's actually kind of an interesting thing to talk about, because I think that it's something that a lot of people kind of don't do very often, which is like really like actually analyzing the like the arrangements of songs that they admire. Like a lot of people just kind of write songs and just hit record, and that's totally fine. But I think the other part of it too is that like sometimes analyzing other songs can inspire you or help you create the vision of like how to actually get it to that pro level, and like figure out, okay, well, this is how they layer their vocals, or this is how they layer their guitar tracks or whatever. And those are the things that ultimately make things sound bigger. So it was kind of fascinating to hear you talk about like how you would listen to your tracks. So maybe you can dig into that a little bit. Like, how did you train your ears to like be able to pick up on those little details, I guess?
I mean, it just came from a point of interest, really, like I remember high school, I would like, or even middle school, I would sit down with my best friend, like we each, Walkmans, and like each had one side of the headphone, and like we discussed like, oh, check it out. If you just have this one, you just hear this part really clearly. And so like these things start jumping out. And so just by doing that, I started noticing it a lot and being very interested in it. So it really just came naturally from listening to music to me. It was never something that I had to be like, okay, I'm going to look into this and focus on this or that. It just jumped out to me at that point. And then clearly, hopefully you never have to, but if you were to listen to that record we did in high school, you'd be like, wow, this is not just like borrowing ideas. This is literally copying. But that's how you learn. And I could still see all that kind of listening that I did back then and through the years affecting my mixes. I always, think about how my mixing is like so influenced by records like, the Stone Temple Pilots, Tiny, music from the Vatican songs, like Brendan O'Brien, like that kind of world. Like you hear my mixes, and even if it's completely different style, there's a lot of that kind of sound that is in my mixing and the way I pan stuff, the way I use effects and that kind of thing. And it just becomes that. It's like, I paid so much attention to those records, and they hit me emotionally so hard that it just became part of my style. And the other thing that I would say is, as you're copying these things, if you keep developing it, copying from here, from there, from like all these things that you copy, eventually you create your own sound, as opposed to just sounding, like I said, like my band where it was like, oh, look, that's David Gilmour trying to, doing that melody line there, or like whatever, it's, at first you start being like very, very like, oh, that's very obvious. But then all these combinations create your own sound. And, in a way, that's what art is, you absorb everything around you and you turn it into your own kind of voice.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I can kind of relate to that myself. Like I remember my first experience in the studio, we were kind of like a punk band or whatever. And I remember like we recorded our tracks and they sounded good, but like, I always felt like, oh man, like something's missing. These guitars feel thin or whatever. And then I'd listen back to my favorite records and be like, I think I'm hearing like 2 tracks of rhythm guitar or something like that, and like, then you kind of start to pick up on like, well, should we double track these guitars? Is that the move?
Exactly.
And then we did it, and all of a sudden it just sounded great. So, it's like sometimes you have to just really, I think it's a good exercise for engineers to like, not just listen to music for enjoyment, but actually listen to like understanding like the little details of what's happening on the kick drum, what's happening on the guitars, the vocals, and all that kind of stuff.
And I mean, I still do it to, this day, every new record that I listen to, it's not that I'm analyzing the whole time, but my ear is always just picking up on these things at this point. Like I never listen to music not thinking about this at some level.
Yeah.
It's just always there. And in a way, that's also part of what being an assistant is. you get to see what all these big artists and engineers do, and you copy all these techniques that you like, and eventually create your own techniques based on that. You're like, oh, I saw this engineer mic drums this way, and I really liked it. And I saw them when they mixed, they did, this effect on the vocals, and I think for this kind of song it really works. So you start copying those things. So it's in essence the same idea. You're just part of the process and as an assistant, but that's where you're learning.
Absolutely. The other thing that you mentioned at the beginning was that was kind of interesting to me was that idea of you realizing that you were a better engineer than producer. And I think, you've been at this for a while now. So I feel like the lines between the producers and engineers these days has blurred a lot, especially.
Totally. I mean, the definition of producer is so different these days.
Yeah. So how would you currently define the role of a producer versus an engineer and what that looks like?
I think there's one big thing that you have to talk about first, which is what genre you're talking about. Because, producer in anything in the hip hop world is the guy who makes the beats.
Yeah, it's almost like a writer.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and then, and they are producing the beats. So it is, he is a producer. I'm not, words evolve with time, I guess. And that way the definition of producer has changed. It now means two things. So that's one kind of producer. And then if you go more towards like the jazz world or singer-songwriter, that kind of thing, you're talking about somebody who is in charge of delivering the record in whatever state it needs to be to whoever it has to get to. And that can be from basically saying like, hey, you guys like that studio and this engineer? Sure, let's go there. And just sitting in the back and be like, hey, you guys sound great. Sure, we're done. So it can be nothing but just like, yeah, you guys got it. And just making sure everything gets done on time and that kind of thing. To a producer who does, playing in the sessions and maybe even engineering. And, I've self-engineered some records that I've produced as well, of course. And it could be people who do charts. I work with producers who conduct the string orchestra of the records they're producing. And, basically everything in between, including budget, organizing for musicians, hitting deadlines, making sure if the style has to be something that it kind of sits in that style. If it doesn't, then that, of course, that doesn't matter. And then as you hit that world of pop that we have these days, where like so much of our pop these days is that combination of beats and singer-songwriter, the definition of producer can be anywhere in between those two worlds. And sometimes it's two producers because there's one who wrote the beat and one who's more in charge of the development of the song. So I think that's sort of the definition I would put on it, but it's very broad because the term is so broad these days.
Yeah. It's something I always find fascinating because I feel like because it varies from genre to genre, it's confusing to a lot of people. Like,
totally.
Yeah. So these days, like, would you say that you still believe that you're a better engineer than you are a producer?
I would say that I'm a better engineer for any style of music, and I'm let me think of how to say this properly. But I can be a good producer when it's the kind of stuff that fits the type of producer that I am. Whereas, like I can be a good producer for certain kind of records, but I can be a good engineer for pretty much most types of records. Obviously, no engineer is perfect for every record. That's a big lesson we all learned, that eventually you're like, oh, you know what, this record was just not meant for me for whatever reason. But in general, I feel comfortable going into any situation as an engineer. Of course, I wouldn't say that as a producer, but I do have a lot of places where I do feel comfortable as a producer. But I think it really has come with time.
Yeah, I think the engineering side of things is definitely more applicable to different genres. Like the process is more or less the same. It's just a matter of working with different sounds and figuring out how to make those work. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas, as a producer, if you're doing I was recently doing a Sondheim record with a singer who's like very, very close to that world, and a producer that really knows it well. And now we're doing a next record where it's that kind of world again, but just piano vocal, and we don't have a proper producer. And I'm helping out, but I don't know enough of that musical world to be a true producer. I can help out, I can help produce, but I would never, try to jump in there as like, hey, I'll produce this record, because I just don't have that background in myself.
Fair enough. So another interesting thing that I was curious to ask about was that, you like you said, you started in this as a rock musician, And these days, it seems like you work on a lot of music that does have classical elements to it, a lot of strings and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you talked about how you got into composition in school. But as far as the engineering side with the classical side, like, was that something that you learned in your time at Berklee, or was that something that kind of just developed over time, or what that
It kind of just developed over time. I mean, it's funny because, like I said, I was a rock kid, and rock is the thing I do the least of. I've gotten to do some, but not nearly as much as pretty much every other genre on the planet. I think that the classical thing came from one interest because I love the music. And here's the other thing: I would say that I've done a lot of classical, but I've done very little classical in the sense of traditional classical, like repertoire. I wouldn't be the kind of engineer to be called for, going to Carnegie Hall and setting up mics to record, Beethoven's Ninth. But I've done a lot of like the so-called like indie classical and like more contemporary stuff where the sonic aspect is very different from that, very traditional like two mic or a few mic capture kind of thing. And it came from, I think, as an assistant, I was working with a bunch of friends and they started doing a lot of strings on their records. And so I started learning to do that. And at the same time, I started working with this producer called Rob Mathis, who's an amazing guy, who one day walked into the studio with his guitars and I was helping him as a GA and I was listening to Mahler, and he's a big Mahler head. And he's like, "Oh, you like Mahler?" And so we started developing a friendship. And when I eventually became assistant, he called, I used to do his sessions, and then eventually I became his engineer, his main engineer in New York. And he does a lot of stuff that's, again, strings and smaller orchestras, horn ensembles, that kind of thing for a lot of pop artists. And so all the fact that I was doing all this made me start to understand how to record, a lot of like the classical instruments. And then I became friends with a lot of people here in New York who delve that world that's between, they'll do classical one day and then they were playing with Sufjan Stevens the next day, or like doing Nico Muhly and then moving over to the National. And so because I had worked with them on Sufjan Stevens, they were like, "Oh, we just started this sextet, classical sextet. Would you mind?" And so I started, I kind of just started all blurring into it itself. And then from there, because I gained a lot of experience in that, I started doing the film score thing, which also involves a lot of, bigger orchestra. And so I can't say that it was a very straight shot towards it. It kind of just happened because of the kind of projects I was working on. It all just developed into that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you kind of became known for being someone that people could trust for that kind of that style of music. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I was curious to ask a little bit about that as well. Is that like, you do tend to work on music like, I know you said you don't call it like the traditional classical. To me, it's just like organic sounding music.
Correct.
It's very natural. Like, it doesn't feel like that's one of the things that I really admire about your productions is that they don't seem to feel overproduced or heavily sampled or anything like that. It sounds just very organic, like people playing in a room with like the strings or their guitars and drums or whatever. And I think that's something that a lot of people, like, you do a great job of making mixes work with that natural organic sound. And I think that's something a lot of people have a lot of trouble doing, especially these days. It's like people rely on technology so much to, maybe overproduce things, add samples, like, and it's so easy to do so because the technology is just right in front of us all the time, right?
I have that issue myself a lot of times because I love plugins and it's a new toy every day. It's like sometimes you find you're overdoing it and sometimes you have to step it back.
Yeah. So I'm curious to ask you, like, what is the secret to getting that clarity and making things sound natural and organic, but without it going too far? Like, how do you find that balance?
I think first of all, it obviously depends a lot on the project, but it comes a lot from stuff that for the most part is decently recorded with good players, good instruments in a good space, because then you don't really have to do that much other than just like, if I have a very good friend who's an amazing engineer, and he's a very, like heavy-handed rock engineer, and I love his mixing. I mean, he's one of my favorite mixers. And we'd always say, he's like, "Oh, we'll send each other mixes for feedback." And he's like, "Oh, can you maybe I would like give a little more top end to the vocal." And like, I'm like, "Okay, perfect." And I do it, and I like 0.5 dB. He's like, "Why are you doing 0.5 dB?" So we're always joking that I'm always doing very minimal touches. And I think that's a big part of it. If you look at one of my mix sessions, there's a lot of plugins, but they're all doing very little stuff. Like, you look at my EQ curves, and of course, I'm not afraid to go in and hammer something if I need to. But for the most part, I feel that just doing subtle touches gets me that thing where I'm just opening space. I'm, bringing top end where I need it or definition on the low end. But it's never, like I hardly ever do more than 2 or 3 dB on any sort of AVQ. Like for example, I just recently got a console one by Softube, and I set up my default to have their API EQ. And after a couple of mixes, I realized that the fact that their EQs jumped in 2 dB increments was just way too much for me. I couldn't mix like that. Which, if you think about it, it's a little ridiculous because 2 dB is not that much. But it just felt like leaps to me. So luckily they have an API modern version where you can actually do it not stepped. So that's shifted to that, and I feel more at home with that. Same with compression. Like if I do a lot of compression, a lot of times it's in parallel or like super compressed one set of rooms but not another one. So it's that kind of thing. It's not that I'm not doing a lot, but most of what I'm doing is subtle.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how much subtlety can make a big difference, and I think that's something that I hear a lot of mastering engineers on the podcast talk about, where it's like they're making those little half dB moves, and that might be all they do is just like one single half dB move somewhere in the track, and that makes the biggest difference.
It opens up the record or whatever.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is that like when you're getting started, your ears just aren't as in tune to like those changes and what those things sound like and how big of a difference they can make. So people do tend to go heavy-handed because it's more obvious to them. But sometimes when you do that, the downside to that is that now you've changed everything so much in your mix that now you have to kind of shape everything else to fit. And you may be adding 10 steps when one step might have been the solution.
Exactly. And the other thing to take into account, there are the rooms, of course. Like if you don't have a room or headphones that you trust, then you might not be hearing that 0.5 dB because your room doesn't show it because you have a dip in that frequency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or your headphones don't respond to that frequency very well.
Yeah, of course. So just on that note, I mean, you live in New York, and New York is known for having a lot of like smaller, project studios and stuff like that, and rooms that might not be acoustically perfect. So what advice would you have for people who are working in smaller environments to like get to hear some of those little details and maybe if they're not working in a perfectly acoustically treated room, like what can they do?
Well, it's funny because I first started my first room where I started mixing at home as an extra room that I had, and it had no treatment. It had nothing, but somehow it is a big enough room and I had the bed in the corner that acted as a bass trap, and then I had this other closet that was like a cloth closet, and it also worked like that. And like when that would break, I would buy the exact same one, so it wouldn't change the acoustics of the room. And it was really funny because like I'd have people come over and like, oh, this actually my friend who I was telling you that I'm a huge fan of his mixes. One day he calls me up. He's like, hey, can I come check out your studio? See what kind of stuff you did to make it work? And he walked in. He's like, this is your room. I hate you, because there was nothing. It was like a bedroom with like a desk in the middle. But I just got lucky in that it was surprisingly flat as long as you mix soft. So that's one of the things I'm going to say is if you're mixing in an untreated space, mixing soft makes all the difference because you're not getting crazy reflections of the walls. So that's one thing. And that still holds true in my current studio. From there, we moved to another apartment where we had some issues, and I wound up in basically a small square that I could never make work. It was just terrible. It was not the room that was supposed to be my studio, but because of some New York things, it had to be there. And so I basically mixed on headphones for about 2 years while I was there, because I turned on the speakers just while I was kind of editing or something to give my ears a rest, but it just sounded horrible. And luckily, a couple of months before moving to that place, I had bought the Focal Clear Pro headphones, and I was used to them, and I loved them, and it really worked. And then when we moved to our current apartment, the room was not ideal, but decent enough. And then I had the guy who was a tech at the studio where I started at. He's very good at building rooms, and during the pandemic, I gifted him my old computer, which he now used to do a lot of mixing stuff. And as a thank you, he built my room for me. So it's very basic acoustic treatment, but as long as I don't make it loud, it works really well. There was a weird thing where like the left, I forget if it's the left or the right, one of the sides just felt a little louder. So I use a UAD interface. I was able to go in there and just like trim one of the outputs down by 0.5 dB. And it's very even. And I still check on my headphones quite a bit because I'm so used to them. But it's, the tip I would say is like try to find stuff that like big stuff that works as a bass trap. Something like, bed, try to deaden the room, but not not kill it too much. You can see the panels that I have in the bag in my room. I forget the name because my friend who did the room bought them for me, but he got them off Amazon. They're super cheap, just stick to the wall, and they work great. I did buy one of the active bass traps, and it works really, really helps. Those are a little expensive, so probably not what everybody wants to buy on. But it's, then post that, because there's really not much you can do about the acoustics unless you start putting money into it. It's all about listening to a lot of records, having good headphones you can trust, and hearing the same records in your headphones and in your room and comparing, and starting to find those little things, and listen loud enough that you're not missing things, but soft enough that the room is not being turned on too much, because that's when it becomes a problem. And mixing soft is a good idea anyways, because so many of the big mixers do it. It's really good anyways. So
yeah, those are great tips, and I agree with that. Like it's exciting to listen to music loud, but it's also very deceptive, especially in rooms that don't have the treatment. You're just dealing with reflections and all sorts of stuff that can totally mess with your perception of a mix. And I thought it was interesting to hear you talk about how your room was a little like uneven or lopsided as far as speakers went. I think that's also another important thing for people to hear too, is like that is a possibility that maybe one side of your room is more reflective than the other, and you do have to be able to compensate for that. And I think your solution of headphones, or even just adjusting the trim on your speakers, that's important to do too. And the other thing that I usually tell people to do is like, just get a measurement mic and use like Room EQ Wizard. It's free. You can download it. You can probably rent a measurement mic if you want, and just get some sort of reading on your room to get a sense of like, what am I actually hearing, and are there any major dips or any problematic frequencies that I need to be aware of? Because once you're aware of those things, you can learn how to compensate for them as well.
Exactly, totally. I mean, I remember I never measured this in my first room, but I do know that it was, because I did some like sweeps and I would like hear the null, and I do know that like 60 and 120 hertz were like down a little bit, so I learned to compensate for that. And like even today, here's where I mix 95% of my mixing, and you see that door on my right, like basically it's a closet. It's one of those closets that kind of opens up like this. And right now I have it pushed all the way that way. If I actually close both sides of the door, the room just sounds wrong. So I have to actually keep that way. And that closet sort of becomes a sort of bass trap, because, it goes in there and there's like cables and, some blankets and blah, blah, and things that just absorb. So, play with things in your room. If you have doors, close and open them, see what helps, see it sounds better. Like I find that the door that goes that way, I can leave open or close, and it doesn't make a difference. And actually I have a window here that I can have the blinds up or down, and it makes no difference. But then the door that's there, if I open it up, suddenly the low end changes completely. So try these things. My first room, same thing, I worked great. And as long as I had my door open, the door was behind me. We're in my sitting spot. And if I closed the door, suddenly I had a huge reflection bouncing back from that, and it just sounded wrong. So try all these things.
Yeah, it's funny how like a lot of these little details that you wouldn't think make as big of a difference as they can, like they do actually impact things greatly. So yeah, you have to learn. Yeah, love that. Going back to your mixing process, one thing that I think you also do really well with your tracks is like getting your rhythm sections to feel really right. Maybe just as a drummer, to me, like that's something I really admire. Like when I listen to your tracks, I feel like any of the songs that do have like drums and bass, like I feel like you do a really good job of capturing the groove and finding that balance between kick and bass and making you feel it. And so I'm curious to know, like when you start a mix, what do you typically do to get that balance of like the kick and bass and to like lock that groove in and make it feel impactful?
It's funny because, I very often, and first of all, thanks for saying that. So, glad to hear that's the case and how it's feeling, for anybody else listening. But a lot of the times I'll hear, an interview with somebody or a podcast or whatever, and find people talking about like how they think about the lock between the bass and the kick. And I'm like, why can't I do that? And because I don't know why. I never think of one in relation to the other in terms of, here's the kick, here's the bass. How does one need it just is about getting it where it sits right to me with the drum set and the low end of the mix, rather than thinking about like the relation of just the kick against the bass. And maybe that's what makes it work, that I don't obsess over that connection. I just make it feel like, the guy who built my room again, I have two basic theories of how I start my mixing and how I mix, how I go through a mix. And one comes from Kevin Killen and one comes from Bradley, who's the guy who was a tech at the studio who built my room. And he once told me, and I think he sticks by this at this point, is like, if you're mixing and your body's not going with the groove, you're not mixing right. And I find that's very true. Like if I'm mixing anything that has that kind of thing in my body, and I'm kind of not going like this with my foot or doing this as I'm mixing, then it feels that I know that the groove's not right yet. And so it's really just finding what I like, fits the style and the type of recording that I have, and what I'm going for, and making it just sit where I feel the groove. But I can't say that I have any specific trick or anything that I use, because like I said, I even like see people talking about it. I'm like, I just can't think of it like that. It's a bit of a no answer, but
no, but I think you said something that is actually really important, which is that like you said, you tend to focus more on like the frequency balance more than the actual instruments themselves. And I think that is something that a lot of people, when you're mixing and you're just focused on one track, it's like it's so easy to just like lose sight of the big picture. Totally. And really all of these details, like volume is one of the most powerful things when it comes to mixing.
The most.
And just turning up your kick and your bass, like without thinking about it as kick and bass, like those are low end, and you're creating that low end balance in your mix. So, feeling that low end, it often just comes as a result, just turning things up to the right levels, and not having to do a whole lot more beyond that.
Yeah. I mean, I had one of the most, silly and stupid aha moments at one point mixing a score, and how you always hear these amazing scores by like people like, Hans Zimmer and stuff, where like the percussion and the drum search is like so loud and punchy and cool. And I could just never get them that way. And then I was doing a mix for a score for Carter Burwell that had that kind of vibe. And I realized that the solution to it is literally that, just making it loud. I did nothing to it. I was just like, it was not feeling right. And I was like, okay, let me bring it up 4 dB. And I was like, oh, there it is. And yeah, it's just volume. And the other thing is, I think I do still work in solo for the most part when I'm EQing and working on a sound. But through the years, I've managed to learn how that's going to work when everything else is up. And so I'll work on the bass sound in solo, and then I'll work on the kick on it solo. But then, like by the time I work on the bass, I already have the drum sound usually. So I know what kind of space I have for the bass. And then as I bring the bass up, then I'll go back and maybe retouch stuff, or, like I'll also do the kind of thing where like I'll get a mix going and I'm relatively, at a well advanced in it. And then I'm like, I'm just not getting enough kick. It's not feeling right. And even if I'm at the point of doing automation, I'll go back and re-EQ my kick a little bit, and there's also the times where you have to just say, save as, reset everything and start from scratch. That happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's sometimes it's just an experiment. You're just kind of playing with things, different settings to see what ends up getting you that emotional reaction to what you're doing. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is that I don't work with templates at all. Like, and I think that makes it so that I'm never locked into this way of working or that way of working. Rather, my flow goes with what the project needs at the moment. And I think that's one of those big things that helps with that. Because if you always work with a certain template, then your sound is going to somehow fall into that, like have certain limits around it. Like suddenly you're like, oh, I need more of this or that. You can't, because your whole drum set is going through a drum bus, and suddenly there's no way you can just bring up your kick without just more compression. So like, I think you have to think project by project, song by song, each mix, as its own thing. It's a little slower because, I can't just import stuff into a template. I think of it more like when you were mixing on a console, just like tracks just come down a channel, everything goes out to the stereo bus, and I add subgroups or parallel compression buses as I need them, if I need them only.
Yeah. But I also think that argument has to do more with like how you use templates too, right? Like you can create templates that don't have all the plugins in like active and then have your settings in there. I think there are templates that could just get you up and running faster and have your track a certain way, whatever, But
I think it has to do with my OCD.
Yeah,
in the sense that if I'm in a template, I work like that. Yeah, so it's personal in that sense.
It's just a personal workflow thing. And I think even when you make a template, like there is no one template that works for everyone. So it's finding, where you like your tracks and what plugins you like or how you like to write your tracks. Like whatever you determine to be your flow, find a way to like optimize that.
Exactly. And for me, that's the thing. Having no template lets me just go with the flow of the song.
Yeah.
As opposed to thinking of one way or another. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But again, that's like you said, that's for me. I know plenty great engineers who do amazing work with templates.
Yeah, of course. Going back to like the groove thing, like how much do you rely on tools like compression or like, transient designers and stuff like that to help you with like emphasizing the grooves and creating more movement in a track?
Some, but not necessarily a lot. I've been getting more into a lot of saturation, and I am liking that. For years, I never compressed a kick or a snare, and over the last 2 years, I started doing it. Very rarely fully, but I'll do it maybe 20% parallel or something like that. I've discovered that it does help the transient cut a little more. I very rarely use transient designers on stuff like a kick or snare or like but like maybe I'll do something where I'll have a parallel drum bus and I'll throw a transient designer there, shaper there, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it really comes down with just the volume, a little control through compression, and more EQ than compression, I think. And space, that's the other thing. So much of it is the space. If the kick and the snare feel here, but then like all your overheads are just like pumping here, it kind of takes away from that kick and snare. Whereas if you have kick, snare, and then like the air, that kind of helps create this dimension of groove to me. But I don't rely too heavily on compression.
Yeah, I think compression is one of those things that I definitely know some people that are like very focused on trying to like get the release times right, so it's like pumping with the song or whatever. So everyone's kind of has their own approach, but that's one reason why I asked you that, because like I said, like I feel like I can really feel the grooves of your song. So I wasn't sure if that was something you were playing with or not.
It's all the musicians, playing it right.
Yep, that makes sense.
Me not getting in the way, but they're doing the groove.
Yeah, for sure. Well, another element of the groove that I feel like I was maybe noticing was that, especially when it comes to like kick drum, for example, I felt like your mixes tend to focus more on like maybe like 100 hertz or something like that with the kick drum. You tend to emphasize a lot more of that as opposed to like, in the rock world, you hear a lot more people emphasizing more of the beater sound and like the 2K area and that kind of thing. And to me, I think, and maybe it's just a stylistic thing, but that kind of thumpier sound for the kick drum kind of also emphasizes a lot more of that too. And the balance is a little different than had you had a ton of click, right?
Yeah. I think that comes a lot from the styles I work in. Like I love a Blood Sugar Sex Magic kick that's all just like attack like that also, but I don't do a lot of work in that style. So most of the records that I do, are a little bit of a rounder kick that's, kind of warm and a little more thumpy tends to work better. And then if you're going into the world of pop and hip hop and that kind of thing, same thing. It's not so much about the 4K or 3K, but more about the low mids and that like chesty thing. So I think that's where it comes from. I think it really is just based on the style of music and also the way the drummers are tuning and playing their kick drums. That's the other thing.
Yeah, of course. Well, another element of your mixes that I wanted to dive into too is I think you do a really great job with picking the right type of ambience to use in your productions as well. Like, I feel like your mixes, you do a great job of placing the listener in a specific environment. Like, I was listening to like the songs on your website and it's like, there's some songs where I'm like, cool, I can hear myself in the concert hall with these people. Yeah. And then other ones I'm like, this sounds like I'm in a bedroom with someone. And like, they're just playing this like right in front of me. So as far as like finding ambience and getting that right and creating the spatial, situation for a mix, how do you go about choosing what you're going to use and as far as ambience goes?
Well, that's my first that's the Kevin Killen part of how I start a mix. I heard him do a talk. It's a really great talk. I recommend it for everybody. It was at South by Southwest, I want to say, but I might be wrong. I can look it up and send it to you so you can recommend it to people.
I'd love to check that out. Yeah.
He does a little chat. It's like an hour long, maybe a little less, where he talks about this. And the way he starts to mix is he actually works with the vocal first and EQs it, compress it, and like finds an effect, and then that's his effect. And what I did is I kind of grabbed that, and while I don't EQ or work on my vocal sound, I start a mix usually by bringing up the vocal and finding out the effects that I want on it to create that, basically choosing what the mix space is going to be. And then I'll bring down the vocal, forget about it, obviously always keeping it in mind, but like not worry about the vocal, and then go back and start with drums or bass or whatever I do. But by then I have my effects sort of chosen. It doesn't mean that I want to add something else or maybe, halfway through the mix, like, what, this one's not really doing it. Let me change it or just nudge it a little bit. But that's really the first thing I do is, think about my effects for the song. And that way, as I'm bringing up my mixes, I'm working track by track. I start setting into my effects. And so by the time all my faders are up, basically all my scents are also kind of there. And then at that point, obviously, you might automate some stuff, add a little, something here or there. But the overall feeling of what the space of the song is there.
Gotcha.
And
Yeah, you're working within that environment.
Exactly. The whole time, like it's always there. Because it's, it's basically the space in which your mix is. So to me, that just makes a lot of sense. And the way I go around choosing it is I kind of listen to a song, and this goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, kind of reference like, oh, this has a Peter Gabriel kind of vibe. I would love to kind of do the, RMX style snare. So, okay, now I know that my room is going to be the RMX nonlinear or something like that. Or, it kind of like what this song brings out in me in terms of like what I know. And I'll grab those ideas like, okay, this is that kind of reverb. And so it can go from anywhere from being like, okay, we want to just keep it very natural sounding and just have a little room and maybe a little short plate or something like that, to we're going to a Beach Boys kind of sound, or, a very poppy kind of thing, or like, oh, this is really pop. And I heard a Taylor Swift song where like there's this like really long, bright reverb, like I want to give air with that reverb. So I think of all these things conceptually, create my sense, and then start mixing into them.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah, I think that that's also like an area that a lot of people struggle with early on, is like figuring out effects, and when you look at like reverb, there's so many different types of reverb, and even within all the plugins, there's a million presets that all have different EQs and all sorts of stuff. So it can be very overwhelming to determine like what is the best reverb to use on a track, or so do you have any advice there as far as like how people can narrow down their options and maybe get a better sense of like where to, should I use a plate reverb versus a hall or something like that, right?
Yeah, I think it comes down back to, listening to records that you like and analyzing and feeling, trying to understand what each sound is. Oh, this sounds like a digital Rex. I can hear, like that clearly, like that's like very, early digital kind of sound from like a, what's a EMT 250 or that kind of thing. Or this sounds very natural, like a Bricasti, or, oh, this definitely gives a sense of a room like a chamber, or the metallic sparkle of a plate. So starting to recognize those things in records. And then being like, okay, I want this kind of vibe. And in terms of the, the amount of plugins, like I said, I use all sorts. I like I said, I love plugins, and I'll use all sorts of reverbs. I usually have, in a big pop mix, I'll have something like 9 or 10 different reverbs going at the same time. And what I use in one song from the same record might be completely different to the reverbs that I use on a different one. And it's all sorts of bands. I have tons of reverbs. Some I use a lot, some I don't. But every now and then I find like, oh, this is a perfect moment for this reverb. I think it's the thing to learn it is listen to records and then play with the whatever plugins you have. If you just have the stock, Logic plugin, it has great options, and just listen through them and see what each one gives you. So that when you go to a mix and you're like, oh, I want this style or this vibe, you kind of know where to go to. That I guess sense. That really is a thing. It's just like learning what each sound is like.
Yeah. I would just add to that too, like, maybe before you listen to records and kind of see what's going on there, like actually spend some time within your plugins first to like click on a plate, click on a hall, click on a chamber, right. And then you can, load up a snare drum or a vocal and see how those sounds react to the reverbs. And then I think once you kind of have that training, then I think listening to other songs makes it easier to,
That's true. Because otherwise, how are you going to know what's the what, right? Yes.
It just sounds good. And you're like, oh, what is that, right? Yeah. But I think what you said there is spot on.
I think to me, effects are very, it really is all about emotion and what, where you're going to play the track. It almost goes like to an era kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, this song has this, Motown vibe. Oh, let's check out the, UAD chamber, Hitsville chamber. This is a Sting kind of vibe. Oh, let's go for a more, a Clear Mountain kind of effect.
Yeah. You mentioned that you'll have like maybe 9 reverbs on a plug in a mix session. Are you sharing tracks in those reverbs, or does every instrument have its own?
No, I mix in the, similarly to how you would in a console where you have, your sends going to reverbs, and you send from every instrument that needs it goes to the same. So, I might have mixes where one reverb is getting a bit of everything, maybe except kick or, the bass. But even sometimes I even add kick and bass. And then there's some reverbs that are only getting one thing or another. There's all sorts of, anything can happen. but I very rarely think of like, oh, this reverb is just for the vocal, because I want the whole mix to sort of live within the same world usually, unless you're going for something very specific where you want like, oh, we want the bounce sound like they're in this style, and then there's this vocal that has nothing to do with it flying over it. Then you might, that's a specific situation. But for the most part, I use a lot of the same reverbs on everybody.
That makes sense.
And and when I say that I have 9 or 11, it's not for every song. Obviously, if I'm doing a folk song with 3 people playing, I'll have 2 maybe.
Yeah, but I think what you said there makes a lot of sense. Like you're making them feel like they're sharing the same space, as opposed to the drums being in space and then the vocal in a church or whatever. You know, like they have to have some sort of cohesion to make it all work together.
Exactly. Yeah, unless it's for a specific effect, then that's a different thing. Yeah, that's basically how I think of it. Just the space and the emotion I get from the effects, and who needs what.
Makes sense, yeah. I know a lot of engineers will often prefer using delays over reverbs or reverbs over delays. Do you have any preference there?
I use a lot of delays, but I use them to create space within the reverb. In fact, I do think it's one of my, I'm not going to say failure, but there's certain kind of project that I'm just not the right person, because I use reverb a little too much, perhaps, for that kind of project. I don't think I very rarely mixed a vocal without at least 2 or 3 reverbs on it. I'll use delay more as like either a candy kind of thing, or to help create the space that lives within the reverb.
So are you using like a pre-delay almost, or?
No, it's weird. I very rarely use pre-delays on my reverbs. That's one of the things that I just don't like. I find it makes it all messy, unless it's again for a specific effect. Most of my reverbs are always 0 pre-delay. And then what I'll do is I'll have rhythmic delays within the song that kind of are there on a lot of things, and a lot of cross panning or like, that kind of thing. But it's very subtle, where you don't necessarily hear the echo, but it almost sounds like it's a reflection in the reverb.
Gotcha. Yeah, so you're not getting that. It's not like a sustained tail thing. It's just you're hearing like reflections, like defined reflection.
And they're based on the, like it'll usually be like an 8th note or a 16th note, or whatever fits right in the song. So it's rhythmic to the song. But I do like, for the most part, having the reverb start right away, as opposed to having a pre-delay. And I understand, obviously I'll do it. If you're going for like that Radiohead, like the voice is here and the effect, like really, obviously then you can't escape having a pre-delay. But unless you're going for that kind of effect, I tend to not use pre-delays.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I agree. I'm kind of the same way. Like I never really use the pre-delay unless I'm working with a song that has a lot of space, and like that pre-delay adds kind of a rhythmic feel to it or something like that. Then that's where I might use it myself. But generally,
in fact, what I usually do a lot is, if I want to, like, for example, have a snare with some pre-delay, what I'll do is I'll create a send that's just the delay, but not going to an output, and then use that to send to my reverbs. That way the reverbs still have 0 pre-delay, but I can have the option of sending anything that I want to pre-delay on through that extra send.
Gotcha. How much do you tend to lean on like the room mics that have been recorded?
Quite a bit, especially if you're dealing with strings, horns, that kind of thing. I use them very, very heavily. I tend to like that sound better than closed mics on orchestras and on strings, string quartet. And the hard thing is then it suddenly becomes a push and pull with the client when they want more or less of this. And there's times where you just can't avoid leaning more on the closed mics, because they want, they want to be able to hear things very specifically, or like, oh, I really need to bring this cello up here. But I try to go for room mics, at least as a starting point.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When it comes to something like that.
So as a recording engineer, do you have any tips then for how to capture great room sounds?
Yes, the first one, unfortunately, is the room. Find a good room, because it really is all about that. All you're doing is just putting a couple pair of mics and hoping for the best at that point. It's about finding something in the room, finding the symmetry of the room, how things are going to speak from one side to the other. And I tend to think of my room recording as almost as frequency versus definition. Like I'll use an XY or something like that for my presence and my clarity of my, like the spread. But then I'll use a pair of omnis as wides to like bring in the low end and the warms, even though they are a little facey. And so then it's about finding the balance between those two, where you're getting enough definition, you don't feel the hole in the center, but it's still nice, big, and warm. Obviously, check your face. That's a big one. Then like sometimes I'll use like I love ribbon mics on rooms because they, even though they give you that weird hole in the center because of the bloom line, they, again, it's just like you have the brightness of the C of the XY, then you have the width and big low end from the whites, and then the mid range and presence can come from that ribbon. So it's all about, I think of it very frequency based in terms of what mics I choose.
That's an interesting approach because, yeah, I always hear people talk about it more as in like distance and like, sometimes you want a tighter sound and sometimes you want it to be really massive. And that makes sense why you would have different pairs of room tracks. But I think the frequency example that you gave there is a really interesting way of approaching it. And,
yeah, I really think about it frequencies.
Yeah, and choosing the right gear to get you that brighter sound versus the darker ribbon sound. I think that's really interesting. And I think it gives you more options to play with, if anything.
Totally. And, especially when you're doing the kind of thing which is so common these days, I mean, I guess always, you're doubling or tripling a string quartet. If you have a couple different pairs, like maybe on my first pass, I'll do mostly the whites, a little bit of the XY and a little ribbon. And then for the second pass, I'll do much more of the ribbon and much less of it. And then for the third one, I'll do more of the XY and still keep the ribbon up and less of the, or like even them all out. So basically each set sounds a little different. So you get less facing happening, but it's still the same room. It's still the same musician. It's still the same cohesive sound.
Yeah, very cool. So I know you said that the biggest thing that you could advise us with when it comes to room sounds is the room itself. But for people who are working in smaller spaces, do you have any tips there for how to maybe get the most out of a smaller space?
I think trying to break up the walls a little bit. If it's like a harsh sounding room, try, just putting some blankets on the walls, like even if it's just like tears against the wall, just like stuff that breaks up the room a little bit. So it's not just like full, everything's just bouncing back and, making that harsh sound. Try to break up the room acoustically. And then start by getting the musicians as comfortable as possible. Because if they're comfortable and playing where they're feeling balanced, you're already, much closer to getting the right sound. And then walk around the room, see if further or closer to the musician sounds better. Like, just actually using your ears to see, oh, if I move further away, suddenly it's sounding more hollow. Or, oh, no, I actually, get on a stool and come up here and, oh, at this height, I actually feel a little more warmth and less of that, like, of this ringiness in this room. And then the other thing is, know that once you start recording, you will have to EQ some stuff, and that's fine. Even I work a lot out of Power Station Studio A, which is the old, Power Station Avatar, now Power Station again. And it's a beautiful room, but it's a tricky room for strings because it's a very bright room. And so, you have to EQ it quite a bit still, even if, get it sounding good, it still needs a lot of EQ.
Mm-hmm. But again, I guess, to what you talked about earlier, like using ribbon mics would be a great tool for that to soften some of that top end up a little bit. So it's kind of just knowing the gear and how that shapes the overall frequency response of everything.
Yeah. I mean, a great example of that is the typical room mic for of excellence is, M50s or M150s, right? By Neumann. And I have 3 Blue Omni mics from, Blue from before they were bought over about 10, 15 years ago. And they're sort of the same idea of an M50 or M150, where it's a Omni set on a capsule, so it makes it more cardioid on the higher frequencies. And they're much dark because they're they're not a M50. They're much darker and kind of mid-rangey sounding. They're not quite as wide sounding. And when I'm in Power Station A, a lot of times I rather use my Omni mics than the Neumanns, because the Neumanns are so hi-fi that it becomes too bright, whereas the Blues kind of just like dull that down a little bit and give you, help fight that part of the room.
Love it. Yeah. Yeah. I guess, kind of what we talked about earlier, it's really just about the critical listening and, being aware of your surroundings and how that impacts everything. And then, listening to how your gear sounds, and then, trusting
and knowing your gear.
Yeah. Knowing your gear so that you could choose the right gear for the room that you're working in and for that vision that you have for the sounds and all that stuff. So
yeah, exactly. And it's hard because, obviously if you're recording in a less than ideal room, it probably means that you have limited selection of gear. But, if you're going into a room and you have the choice of, it's a bright room and you have a choice of C451s or, a pair of ribbons, maybe go with the ribbons.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a good point to bring up too. Like, yeah, if you're working in a less than ideal room, you probably don't have all that gear available to you. But then you might want to look then to like mic positioning and like, maybe you face the microphones away from the instruments or something like that to make things sound a little darker, or whatever you can do to try to figure out how to control the sound a little bit more. Or like you also said, like, putting blankets up and stuff like that.
And the other thing is, if you're in a really bad room, then set up a couple of room mics. You'll EQ and compress them and add saturation or whatever to them later. But you'll have to rely on the closed mics, and that's fine too. You can get a great sound with closed mics as well. So if you're really in a room where you're like, there's no way this room is going to sound beautiful, set up some room mics, get them as best you can, and then in mix work with that and your closed mics. Create your own space with reverbs.
Love that.
Because that's the thing. Even when I'm in a beautiful room, like I'll get tracks from Abbey Road, which is obviously a beautiful room, and still add reverb to them. So, reverb's your friend here.
Yeah, just because you're working in a really nice room doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. Or just because you have the great gear doesn't mean it's going to be perfect either. There's still always tweaking to be made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this wouldn't be fun, right?
Yeah, of course, right?
we love the tweaking.
Yeah, I love it. Alex, this has been great, man. I've really enjoyed learning more about your process and your way of thinking when it comes to the gear and how you approach your productions. And it's been very fascinating. And I think you do a great job of articulating the mindset behind why you're doing things, which is really important, especially for the audience to take that and run and apply it to their own productions. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
Of course.
If people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Always, my Instagram's open. I have my personal, it's at Udermind, or the Studio One Udermind Studio Pics. You can always message me through there. I typically do see messages. I might take a bit to respond. Otherwise, there's a contact in my page, alexvenguer.com, and that comes straight to my email. So those are 2 easy ways to reach me.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely put those in the show notes as well, so people have those too.
Beautiful.
Right on, man. Alex, thank you again. This has been awesome.
Thank you.
And it's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, same here.
So that was my interview with Alex Venguer, and I really appreciated his philosophy on recording and mixing and focusing on getting sounds right at the source, but also being very mindful of how the tracks that you're recording will impact the overall frequency spectrum in a mix. And I like how he talked about his approach to room miking and how he will, choose specific gear to impact that frequency spectrum, and having, small diaphragm mics for brightness versus some ribbon mics that are going to be a little bit darker. It's definitely a really interesting approach that ultimately does give you that ability to have that balanced frequency spectrum that he really focuses on in his mixing process. And you should too. I also thought it was really interesting to learn more about how he likes to start his mixes with effects on, so that things like reverb, those are just part of the tracks, essentially. That is the aesthetic of the mix, and he mixes into that, and he's constantly shaping things around that sound to make sure that it's all cohesive, it all works well together. I think that's a really interesting approach. And, like I said in the interview, when you listen to his mixes, you feel like you're in a specific environment listening to those tracks. Like you feel like you're in a bedroom, or you feel like you're in a concert hall or something like that, cafe or whatever it is. You feel like you're there with the artist. So I think it's a really interesting approach because, when you start with those kind of effects on early on, you're working within that environment, as opposed to people who add effects on at the end, where sometimes it can feel like you're just using the effects to maybe fill in space, but you're not necessarily creating an atmosphere that the listener is in. So it's just a really interesting approach to mixing overall. And I think it shows a lot when you listen to his productions. So yeah, I personally learned a ton from that episode, and I definitely want to incorporate a lot of his philosophies on gear selection and atmosphere in my mixes. I really appreciate what he shared in this episode here. Now, if you listen to this episode and you're thinking to yourself, like, sure, it's all good to use all this equipment if you have it accessible, but like, I don't even know what the vision for my projects is. I don't know what I want my track to sound like, or if I did, I don't even know how to get there or what tools to be using. So if you're interested in learning more about that, that is exactly what I help my students with inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. In that program, we focus on the entire production process from beginning to end, and we help you establish what is that sound that you're trying to get. And then we reverse engineer that sound for you. We help break down the process of allowing you to know what kind of mics to use, what mic positioning to use, and how to tweak things to ultimately get that sound that you're after. So if you're interested in learning that process and getting feedback as you implement that on your tracks, you want someone who can listen to your tracks, tell you what you need to work on, what's going to help push the needle forward fastest for you. That is exactly what we focus on inside of this coaching program. So if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And then I'd love to hop on a call with you to learn more about your processes, to see what's working for you, what's not working for you, what you're struggling with, all that kind of stuff, so that I can determine whether or not I can actually help you. I only work with people in this program who I truly believe I can help. So if you're interested in learning more about that, make sure to visit that website, masteryourmix.com/amplitude. And yeah, let's hop on a call and let's get you the help that you need. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end. And I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.